counter protester who was killed in Charlottesville last weekend was memorialized on Wednesday. During the service, her mother said, "They tried to kill my child to shut her up. Well, guess what? You just magnified her. I want you to pay attention. Find what's wrong and say to yourself, what can I do to make a difference? And that's how you're going to make my child's death worthwhile. I'd rather have my child, but by golly, if I've got to give her up, we're going to make it count." Amen. Dear Nazis, fascists, white nationalists, KKK members, and just plain old racists, what the hell happened to our country? It may be my naivety showing, but I can say I never expected to be writing a letter to actual American Nazis. I mean, I knew you existed, but I foolishly thought you were on your way to extinction. And suddenly, there are far more of you than I could have imagined. With books like Simon Wiesenthal's Night being required reading in my middle school, high school, college, and graduate school, I assumed everyone knew far too much about the rise of Nazis in Germany and the atrocities they committed to ever allow them to be a vocal presence in our world again. But there you were, cutting a path through the night with your burning tiki torches, using the steady decline of Confederate statues as an excuse to exercise your rage. And I, along with millions of other Americans and people around the world, am at a loss. My insides are twisted with emotions. I'm simultaneously pissed, sad, disappointed, ashamed, bereaved, surprisingly thankful, and way down there, in a back room I barely want to admit to, I may have a twinge of compassion. But I think there's a natural flow to these sorts of things, so let's begin with my initial reaction, anger. I'm enraged because you have radicalized a part of a generation of young white men. Radicalized them from lonely, isolated boys into domestic terrorists who believe that killing their countrymen and countrywomen is the only way to protect their supposedly God-given authority over other races and religions in this land. A supreme irony, by the way, based upon what I can only deem to be an intentional ignorance of our country. You know as well as I do that this land you claim as yours was first stolen by murderous means from the indigenous people by Europeans. And I would be amiss to not recognize the smattering of women in your midst. Women too naive to realize that the type of racism and anti-Semitism spewed by white nationalists originates from the same hateful breeding ground as sexism, and as such they are all indisputably linked. I'm angry too that you scared the hell out of minority groups in their own towns, literally traveling from across the country to their neighborhoods, delighting in their fear. Two of my best friends felt forced to have the talk with their 4-year-old son because he's biracial and Jewish. They were worried about his safety, even in their liberal Massachusetts town. He was forced to face realities that no child should have to face, that a stranger may want to hurt him because of his identity. Chris Cian, a resident of Charlottesville, said, "They killed our friends. They planted the seed of suspicion. I'm suspicious today of the people around me. They planted that seed." You've made people newly wary of their neighbors, of Christians, of white people, all while believing you and only you are entitled to the promises of freedom that live within our country's borders. I'm livid at your thirst for violence. You came with helmets, face shields, bats, batons, mace, and guns. So many guns. More guns than people in your rally. You simultaneously claimed you hoped for a peaceful protest and that you'd happily kill people who got in your way. When Heather Heyer was murdered by one of your own, Christopher Cantrell, he said it was justified. He said he carries guns and goes to the gym to make himself more capable of violence. He said many more will die before he gets his way. The organizer of your rally, Jason Kessler, tweeted that her death was payback time. They were gleeful about it. I'm disappointed too. Disappointed in my fellow white people who have yet to speak out against this disgusting show of white power. Disappointed in our president's reticence to clearly denounce Nazis. Disappointed in my colleagues knowing that it took only until yesterday for one and only one of our president's evangelical advisors to speak out against his statements when his business advisors and arts advisors and members of his own staff condemned it days ago. Disappointed that these white nationalists feel emboldened and taken seriously now because of their friends in high places. I'm ashamed because I know I have been complicit in the rise and sustained power of white supremacist culture through ingrained systematic oppression. That at times I have enjoyed my position of privilege so much that I've been too comfortable letting my human siblings suffer so that I can maintain it. And I'm grieving for the lives lost to violence, for the state of the world that I am raising my children in, for my congregants who may experience fear, for the individuals and families whose lives are affected by racism and religious intolerance each and every day. I'm grieving for the difficult years ahead of us and the hard work we still need to do in order to begin the healing and atonement that is so desperately needed. But oddly enough, I am grateful too. See, I want to thank you for striking a match that was already raised and ready to be lit. For several years now, our country has been in the throes of a racial reckoning, with Black Lives Matter on one side and All Lives Matter on the other. People in my life, in my family, on my street, good, honest, kind, and loving people believed that we were living in a post-racism world. A world where they were adamant that all lives matter to everyone, all the time, because all lives matter to them personally. A world where no one hated our black former president because of the color of his skin, only for his politics. A world where black boys and men and women were killed only because they deserved it, not because of a legal system that has roots in racial oppression. A world where Jews were never discriminated against because of their faith, because everyone in America is entitled to pursue the American dream. A world where explicit racists were bizarre, mythical creatures who only lived in the deep woods or on the internet, and surely totaled no more than a handful across the country. You showed them, huh? As Jason Payne, a young African-American man in Charlottesville, said about racism, it's always under the surface. It's hard to describe and hard for people to understand, but this all shows the world that racism is still alive. Throughout history, people of color have cried out that yes, racism exists. Jews have cried out, yes, anti-Semitism exists. World citizens cried out, yes, fascists exist. The KKK lingers on, if not by that name, then by new, more click-worthy names like white nationalists. And their cries landed on deaf ears because we hoped, to our detriment, that such a thing couldn't happen here again in the US. But because of you, Nazis, they can see it with their own eyes. Your kind is splattered across television stations, newspapers, and computer screens throughout the country and the world. A Vice documentary has over 30 million views. And not in some, well, they aren't really Nazis or white supremacists. That word is just too harsh for them. Bullcrap. But like swastikas on their armbands, hoods on their cloaks, white nationalist symbols on their polo shirts kind of way. The in your face, you cannot deny it kind of way. You've shaken into action those who were previously content to make excuses for white supremacy. Those too apathetic to march or gather, to speak out or to take a stand. You've united us in a way we hadn't dreamed we'd ever need to again. those for Nazis and those against them. And perhaps this is where my compassion comes into play. As a speaker at yesterday's rally in Clarksville suggested, I do not hate the person who is a Nazi. I hate the ideals he propagates, the language he spews, the actions he carries out. I hate that at some point in his life he was failed and it changed him from a loving, sweet child to what he is now. Somewhere inside you there is the capability for love, hope, tolerance, and peace. And I will not write your humanity off no matter how much I hate your inhumanity. So how do we respond to you? What do we do now? There are several schools of thought and many examples. Last year, Yvette Felicara was arrested for punching one of your Nazi pals, a literal example of the common hypothetical ethics question. She said, standing up against fascism and the rise of Nazism and fascism in this country is not a crime. She said, we have the right to defend ourselves. While this tactic might seem particularly tempting after watching the Vice documentary of Christopher Cantrell, I think non-Nazis can do more good outside of jail. Plus, there are other options, ones that are more effective than violence. By now, most everyone has heard of the German town of Wendelsheim. For decades, they've had to deal with hordes of Nazis taking to their streets and marching. They tried seemingly everything to get rid of them to no avail. So in 2014, they held what was called Germany's most involuntary walkathon. Nazis against Nazis. The whole town got together and raised money for each step the Nazis took, a total of close to $12,000 going to anti-hate groups. They brought banners, food to help keep the Nazis' energy up, painted the road to remind them of all the good they were doing for anti-hate organizations, thanked them at the end with rainbow confetti. They made a mockery of them. This was helpful because violence against white supremacists and white nationalists only helps to fuel their feelings of victimhood. It makes them more insistent that their cause is necessary, that they truly are being oppressed and that their very lives are on the line. Well, some towns have simply closed up shop and ignored them. Comedian Tina Fey farcically suggested we rage-eat sheet cake and grilled cheese sandwiches instead of counter-protesting. But this is a commonly expressed tactic, the idea that if no one shows up, they have no audience, and therefore their voices fade into the void. It limits the exposure of their toxic ideas and reduces their power to intimidate. I like this idea, the same concept behind the advice your mother gave you when dealing with a playground bully. Take away their power and ignore them. Eventually they'll simply crawl back into the hole that they came from. And this might have worked in another era. But these times are not like any times we've ever experienced. It is a privilege to be able to ignore these events. As a young black man yelled yesterday outside of the rally as he was filming it, we're out here being beaten and killed in the streets and you all are just standing here singing. This doesn't do expletive for us. And while I understand his point and could hear the pain and frustration in his voice, I humbly submit he was missing something important about the act of gathering together. I think something transformative can happen when people come together to support love in large numbers. When we see ourselves as a group, we gain courage from one another. We fill one another's bucket of hope just as it's down to its final drops. Our faith in humanity is restored. And perhaps more importantly, we remind ourselves that there are far more of us than there are of you, Nazis. We are not isolated. We are not alone. There were over 500 counter-protesters to every one protester yesterday in Boston. It's from this grounding we have the most hope of taking action that will be beneficial to our cause. Lastly, white supremacists, here's the one truth that my colleague expressed, Reverend Leela Sina, shared, and I think it's important that you understand that we're on to you. You're not protesting the removal of Confederate statues on principle. You're not marching for faith or freedom or whatever you're claiming today, even though you believe that you are. You're doing it out of fear. You're afraid you're not as special as you believe you should be. You're afraid you're losing your power and your privilege. You're afraid you'll be treated with as little kindness and respect as you have offered to those you call your enemy, once the landscape of our world shifts to multi-hued shades of race. We see the fear you hide behind your bravado, but your fear is no excuse for your terrorism, no excuse for your hatred. It has never stopped this world from evolving and never will. You are outnumbered. And even though we know that good will certainly prevail in the end, I, won't let it make me complacent. I know you're not listening. Fear does that. Shuts down our ability to listen to what others are saying, no matter how rational their words may be. But I'm going to keep on saying it. And my voice will join with my neighbors. And their voices will join with their neighbors. And little by little, the whole world will be shouting the truth, that we are in this world together. We are one giant family. And we'll say it until you have no choice but to listen. Sincerely, Charlotte. Amen.